Welcome to today's Global Connections program. I'm Bill Miller. Today, we're going to be taking a look at some hot spots around the world, namely Gaza, Ukraine, and a few others. My guest today is an expert on this topic. Dr. Joe Young is a professor at the University of Kentucky, and he is the director of the Patterson School of Diplomacy and International Commerce in Lexington, Kentucky. Previously, he held several positions at American University. Dr. Joe Young, welcome to today's Global Connections program.
Oh, thanks, Bill, for having me. I'm delighted to be here.
I appreciate you being back with me today. We got so many hot button issues. We could do this every day, probably. But before we get into it, let me mention the Patterson School, if anyone's interested, I'm sure they are. Their website is www.pattersonschool.uky.edu. Just in a sentence or so, what do you do at the Patterson School? I know it's great work, and you're working with diplomats, business people, and a variety of others.
Yeah, so our students are all professional master's students who want to go work in the international sphere. They work in think tanks and government agencies. They work abroad, and in Kentucky, we have lots of folks who are here in Lexington, but also who live as far away as Mauritania and Cambodia.
Very good. Yes, some work in the private sector, some at the United Nations and elsewhere. So, well, very good. Well, let's start off with a real easy one. We'll start off with Gaza. And whatever we say, disclaimer, whatever we say right today may not be the case tomorrow. That's shifting sands in a hurricane, come right down to it. But how do you read the recent peace deal that was cracked October 13th? I guess it was
Mhm.
something like that, between basically, essentially, it was a prisoner swap and a cessation of hostilities for the moment. And then there were about 10,000 fine points that did not clear up. But how do you read that at this point?
Well, first of all, I think it's a welcome respite for them fighting. In the most immediate sort of way, it's a wonderful thing. One of my close friends is actually a professor at American University. His name's Boaz Adzili. He'd been working with many other families trying to get the hostages home. And so I know that their relief is tremendous. And even I know some of those hostages were brought home alive, but getting their remains is also important. And then, of course, all the Palestinians that returned home. So just from the start of that, that's a positive thing to occur. I am a little suspect. I took my first class on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict back in 1996, and that's when I started really thinking about the conflict. And to be honest, in those almost 30 years now, uh, the same issues are around and the same challenges. So I'm not hopeful, or how's another way to say that? I am cautiously optimistic, sort of moving forward. But unfortunately, this brief period we should celebrate, and I'm happy for it. But I'm also cautious.
I totally agree. I think you're absolutely correct. And even the day that the treaty was signed and they had the celebration, there were already people in the Knesset and the Israeli military rattling the sabers saying that once we get our prisoners back, we're going to start bombing again. And that doesn't bode well for the future. So I totally agree with you. Well, listen, one of the biggest sticking points has been a two-state solution. That
Mhm.
you have the Palestinians have their state and the Israelis have theirs, and they live in peace and security and do not go to war with each other. Is that two-state solution dead now that Bibi Netanyahu and the right-wing Knesset is opposed to it, or where are we on that?
Well, I mean, the truth of the matter is it's the only solution. There isn't another way to do this. Each side can't just fight the other and destroy the other and assume that they'll just take all the land. And so one of the biggest challenges with this conflict has always been the extremists on both ends, where, when the moderates get close to a deal, and the moderates were close to a deal back when I first started studying this conflict. it's always the extremists that jump in and sort of recreate the violence. And unfortunately, it's come from both sides. And I'm not trying to say both sides are equally culpable, but what I am saying is that both sides have had extremists who've upset the balance and upset the peace. And from things like suicide bombings to settler murders of Palestinian farmers, there have been these events that have just disrupted the eventual peace. But I think, the point there is there's only one way to resolve this. It's got to be a two-state solution. It's got to be a Palestinian state that's run by Palestinians, not by Hamas, and an Israeli state that accepts that with security guarantees. And that's a challenge. That's a real challenge to try and create.
Mhm. There has been discussion. Well, Bibi Netanyahu has now been declared, I think, a war criminal by the International Criminal Court. And a lot of the foreign policy analysts have said that the Israelis, they certainly had a right to defend themselves from that horrific attack 2 years ago, but they sort of overdid it. And have now, a lot of people are saying they're committing genocide. How do you read that?
Yeah, I was definitely skeptical of those assertions at first. And similar to the US response to 9/11, I think there was a lot of international acceptance and justification for having a violent response, and especially violently responding to Hamas. But I think as the war has continued and there have been certainly war crimes committed on the Israeli side as well as the Palestinian side, but certainly on the Israeli side, uh, it's made it complicated. I'm not sure exactly. I mean, there are other people, lawyers and scholars of genocide who probably are better at weighing in on that point. But what I am sure is that the Israelis could have done a lot more to protect Palestinian lives, especially in the context of the famine that's occurred. Um, and I realize, that Hamas does all kinds of horrible things in war, including using human shields and using hospitals as military outlets, but that doesn't justify the killing of Palestinian children.
No, it certainly does not. But as you look at it, what would you recommend there would be some solutions to overcome these problems? It seems like with the Hamas and the extremists in that group, and the Knesset with the extremists in that group, that it's sort of near the twain will meet. What would you recommend?
Yeah, because it really is a two-level game. Because at one level, the Israeli side and the Palestinian side need to constrain the extremists and the violent extremists on their side before they can reach a deal between the parties. And, Hamas is clearly not someone you can negotiate with, and they're not an organization. Their stated desire, if you read their documents, is the elimination of Israel as a state. That is not a group you can negotiate with. And so until there's, I think, sort of valid Palestinian control that isn't Hamas, that it's going to be a challenge on that side to kind of contain the violence. And then on the Israeli side, as you said before, what's going to restrain them from once they get all the hostages back from being more violent with the Palestinians? Hopefully that restraint is going to come from the US. I feel like the Trump administration, to their credit, they've expended political capital to get this deal made. And I'm sure they would prefer that this doesn't get violent again. And so I'm hoping that the US administration can constrain kind of Netanyahu's his worst decisions to try and regain sort of the high ground and be violent again.
Mhm. Some of the Israelis and some American leaders have recommended that you deport all the Palestinians. That's totally illegal, and it would be ethnic cleansing, would it not?
It's not a solution to the problem. I mean, certainly it's a human rights issue, but also it won't resolve it. I think to resolve this conflict, people have to get to the root of the challenges that both sides face, and just moving everybody out of there. And if you remember when the establishment of the Israeli state occurred, there was discussions where, well, let's just put the Israeli state in Uganda or put it somewhere
Hey,
where, Israelis and Jews from around the world have no real connection to. And so you can't, I think, ask Jews not to be somewhere near Israel in the same way you can't ask the same thing of the Palestinians. And so that's why we're sort of stuck in this. People are going to have to live together. And I'm not a huge fan of Thomas Friedman. He has, been a long time observer of this conflict, but he said one thing in his book, which I think is actually his best work, which is From Beirut to Jerusalem. But he said the Palestinians and Israelis are like a married couple that doesn't have sex, and I think that's kind of true. They're stuck together, and they get no benefits of being stuck together, and they just have to realize that they're going to live together.
and they squabble constantly.
Yeah.
That's exactly true. Well, now that we've got that Gaza problem taken care of, let's move to Ukraine. The situation there, it seemed like Donald Trump was kind of backing off of Ukraine, supporting it, certainly not to the degree that Biden supported it, but he was not very supportive. And he kept thinking, erroneously, he was going to get a deal with Putin. And a lot of observers say that'll never happen. So, what can be done in Ukraine? Should we go back to the old remedy, loading up the European countries and Ukrainians with arms and that type of thing, and help them to defend themselves, or what can happen there?
Well, I'll state my opinion first, which is I'm maybe an old school Cold War hawk in the sense that I don't think we can show weakness vis-a-vis Russia, that we have to really be forceful with them. And I think the US and European allies should be completely committed to Ukrainian sovereignty and completely committed to Ukrainian security. And that could mean a whole range of things. Now, again, there are lots of people who disagree with me on this point, but I think what we've seen, and even as early as the Syrian civil war, which again, that's on Obama, not the Trump administration, but by we, I mean the United States, backed away and let Russia just do whatever they wanted in Syria. And I think what Russia learned from that was that, oh, well, the US, when it gets really hard, they're not going to commit blood and sweat and tears to this. And, I'm not necessarily saying we need to send troops to Ukraine, but I think it should be unequivocal in our support for Ukraine, both with weapons and as well as empowering our European allies, who may have to commit troops if things were to get really bad. I am hopeful, though, because while the current administration has moved back and forth on this issue, it seems like they've also come to the conclusion, like lots of us, that there is no negotiating with Putin. It's, we really have to support Ukraine, and we really have to come to a place where, that aggression is pushed back on. And I think that's where the administration is headed as well.
Mhm. It certainly looks like they're moving in that direction, which is very helpful. And a lot of observers think that if Putin backs off, he will no longer rule Russia. He is out. And his future will not look too bleak, even though he's
Yeah.
got billions of dollars stashed away in Swiss bank accounts or wherever. But he has a short-term future, I would think.
Well, this is a problem for both Netanyahu and Putin, is if they back away from these wars completely, then they have to deal with their own domestic constituencies who are really unhappy with them. And in Netanyahu's case, he could go to prison. In Putin's case, the outcome could be a lot worse. And so those are factors for why these conflicts have dragged on, because these leaders, if they keep them going, they sort of kick the can down the road and don't have to deal with the fact that they're deeply unpopular at home.
Mhm. And that they are. There's no doubt about that. And it's amazing how many leaders take actions, they put in policies that are totally countervailing to what the public wants and what the public thinks that we really need. But we'll talk about that in just a moment. Well, you're watching Global Connections Television, which is a privately funded, independently produced program. The opinions expressed on Global Connections are solely those of the moderator and his guest. We'd invite our viewers to go to our website at www.globalconnectionstelevision.com. If you have a PBS, or you're involved with a PBS station or a community access television station, or perhaps an educational institution, that has an intra-campus television hookup, you have a computer or a podcast, please feel free to share this program with people in your family, neighborhood, and all around the world. Global Connections Television is provided at no cost as a public service to help us better understand international issues and how they impact our lives. Today, we're taking a look at some hotspots around the world, namely Ukraine, Gaza, and tariffs. So I mentioned that one also. My guest is an expert on this topic. Dr. Joe Young is a professor at the University of Kentucky and the director of the Patterson School of Diplomacy and International Commerce in Lexington, Kentucky. Dr. Young, we were talking about Ukraine and what could be done there. Bring it a little closer to home domestically. We've got a major problem with tariffs. And the majority of economists that I've listened to or heard or read about claim that if you have a tariff, you do it very specialized tariff. You focus in on an industry you're trying to protect to help it develop its infrastructure and to build up, and then you can take the tariffs off. But when you do broad blanket tariffs, all you're doing is raising the cost of the good, because it's not the shipping company or the country that bears the brunt of that. It's the consumer, the person who buys the car or the toaster or whatever it might be. And we've got now the latest polls show that our inflation rate is going up, that our unemployment rate is going up, that the cost of living is going up, that everything is going up that we don't want to have go up. And most of it's because of tariffs. And the latest report was that the vendor, the producer of the product absorbed about 25% of the cost. The rest of it is absorbed by the customer. What can be done with these tariffs, and how can they be made more efficient and more effective and more egalitarian, shall we say? They're raising their taxes on the American consumer.
Yeah, well, first of all, I mean, I think this change in our tariff policies is a big departure from, post World War II. The U.S. was the guarantor of a free trade system that has benefited us tremendously. And, we saw in the early 1900s trade wars and ways that countries really use these to kind of create almost economic warfare. And this post-war system has been one that has really been useful both for our global power, but also to bring lots of other countries out of poverty. Now, to be fair, tariffs, the way that tariffs can be beneficial to the U.S. is that it has been so far beneficial to the U.S. deficit, because it's been a way for the U.S. government to collect a lot of revenue, especially as other tax revenues are decreased. But you're right. There's the best way to think about a tariff is a tax, and it's usually a tax paid by the consumer. But interestingly, so far, mostly the tariffs have been absorbed by U.S. companies, which is terrible. But eventually, those U.S. companies are going to pass those tariffs on to consumers. And just thinking about Kentucky's industries, our biggest industries are aerospace and bourbon and other things like this that are global industries that get sent all over the world. Our Those industries are hurt by all these. And in fact, for example, there was a big story in our paper about how bourbon in Kentucky that's being sent to Canada, for example, isn't just being taxed. It's just being taken off the shelf because the Canadians don't, in a sort of nationalist response, don't even want to sell the bourbon. And so, no one really wins from a tariff and trade war. And, I don't think it's a good thing for our consumers, but it's actually right now a really terrible thing for business.
Mm-hmm. Yes, it certainly is. And the latest numbers that came out, in fact, they just came out this morning, indicate that everything you said is right on target. We're going certainly in the wrong direction. And we could actually be walking, I'm going to say slow walking at this point, but we could be galloping here pretty soon into a recession or an international depression. Could we not? I think back Not that you and I were around in 1929, but I think of the Smoot-Hawley legislation and the great collapse of the international economic system. And we're heading in that direction, are we not?
Well, I don't think we are. And I'm not defending the tariffs. Like I said, I think there have been some benefits from it, mainly around creating tax revenue for the government. But the big negatives are they're inflationary, and that's never good. Inflation is like taxing the poor,
Mhm.
and then rising prices for the rest of us. Um, and I think it certainly doesn't help. I mean, I'm not as worried that we're going to enter into a global recession, partially because, you know, China, India, and these other countries are such big economies that
Mhm.
while this is annoying and has all these sort of bad downstream effects, I don't think it's going to be a kind of thing that pushes us into something that looks like 1929. But I'm more someone who focuses on conflict and less on economics. So hopefully,
Mhm.
uh, the people, the real economists, they probably would have smarter things to say. But at least from my perspective, I don't feel like we're headed for a global recession. I just feel like we're really making some bad decisions that are going to lead to and a recession is quite likely is possible or just the slowdown in growth or stagnant wages, rising inflation, these things which are really painful for all of us.
No, it certainly is. And the bottom line is that the consumer has less money in his or her pockets.
Mhm.
There's less money to buy the staples. The groceries are going up, that type of thing. So it's not a very good situation. You were talking about the bourbon industry and how adversely affected it is, which is quite true. And this is something that can, well, it affects families all around the state of Kentucky
Mhm.
and even outside of the state of Kentucky. It's not like it's just confined to one industry, but it's broad based, and we certainly need to figure out a way to get around this thing. That's for sure. I'm thinking about when you were talking about leadership. That is so critical. The United States was without a doubt the leader of the world after the war in 1945 ended. The creation of the United Nations was an idea of Franklin Roosevelt, who was president, but who didn't live to see the creation of the UN. And it was the U.S. has been really the glue that has held the world together. Now, there have been cracks along the way. Some countries grumbled about how the U.S. did it. We had the Cold War we had to deal with, but still, it was the one that offered a little bit of stability. And that's what you have to have, especially in a banking situation, in the financial investments. How do people know where to invest? What's going to happen to their money? Will their properties be confiscated? Will they be nationalized? And it seems to me, and a lot of other people too, that we have basically backed off as being the leader of the world. We have basically put China in the driver's seat, especially as far as electric vehicles go and clean energy. There's no body even competing with China. And we're talking about going back to the 18th or 19th, 20th century use of coal. How counterproductive is that?
Well, I mean, it's in the longer trends in history, this is one of the first times that I know of where a global power like the US has abdicated that role. We've seen lots of transitions in global power across the ages. When Britain kind of abdicated its role, it was not by choice, it was because of a rising US power. Whether other countries may not like this, but the US is still the most powerful country in the world on so many different fronts. And we're not in this place that Britain was in when they sort of stepped down from that global leadership. But it seems like we are consciously making a choice to do so. And as you mentioned, the next country up is likely China. I mean, we see this in development opportunities in Sub-Saharan Africa, for example. We've completely dismantled our USAID programs, and China has stepped right in. And that kind of soft power undergirds, the ability of the of your major powers to get the things they want done in the world done. And I think it's a extremely counterproductive approach. And ultimately, I think I think it's going to be pretty clear that it isn't working, and there's going to be an adjustment. Because I don't think that the way that China ultimately sees the global system is consistent with how we want the global system to run, and eventually we're going to have to get back into it.
Right. When Donald Trump pulled out the World Health Organization the first time, when he was president the first time, the Chinese moved right in. They were delighted to take over, but they were quiet about it. They moved into every sector that they could at the UN legally. And now they're just downright lethal. They go to the UN and point out, we will be glad to be the leader of the world. We can see a world based upon what Chinese philosophy may be, or that type of thing. And when we pull out of the World Health Organization, or we withdraw from the Paris Agreement for climate change, basically we're just abdicating our responsibility and saying, well, here, we'll just turn it over, because a power vacuum will not be a vacuum long. Somebody will fill it. And in this
Yeah.
case, it's going to be China. It won't be France or the UK probably, but it will be China.
Yeah, and that the global system that we've been talking about that really comes about post World War II, it has been tremendous at bringing better outcomes for humans around the world. And I get it. There are lots of ways we can critique it, and there are lots of ways we can say it fell short and people were hurt. But this was a century really where we saw tremendous improvements in human life and democratic governance that allowed a big chunk of the populations of the world to be involved in their governments. And the current challengers to our system are not, as democratically or human rights focused. And if we, allow this world to keep moving in the way that it's moving, and we get this authoritarian wave, that's going to be harmful to millions of people all over the world.
It certainly is. And people, especially in the United States, don't realize, I don't think, how important soft power is. You have to make friends. It's not just the military. You can have a $1 trillion military budget, but that's not going to make you friends with poor people who have no food, have no medicine, that type of thing. But we just don't realize it. Well, I don't realize how quickly these interviews go. In our last minute or so, what have we not touched upon that you'd like to leave with our viewers?
Well, yeah, I think the last thing you were talking about, because I've had the opportunity to speak with a lot of military leaders recently, and they are all very effective at the jobs that they do, and but they don't want to be building wells in sub-Saharan Africa, and they don't want to be doing the soft power things that help support U.S. interests. And so, I don't think anyone in the U.S. thinks the U.S. military should be made smaller or weaker. That's an important part of U.S. power. But I think, like you were saying, these other soft power pieces, USA, the State Department, our universities, all of these things are powerful tools to kind of create a more just and equitable world. I just it confounds me that we don't want to use those tools.
Exactly. It's like the military, soft power, diplomacy, the United Nations. It's all a huge jigsaw, and all the parts have to come together to strengthen one another. But you're absolutely right. Well, Dr. Joe Young, I want to thank you so very much for a very interesting and a very informative program.
Thank you. Thanks for having me on again, Bill.
My pleasure. I'm Bill Miller. Thank you for joining us today on Global Connections Television.